Alrighty, I think we can get started. Hello all, and thank you for joining us for this week's installment in our ongoing webinar series discussing natural disasters, severe weather, and how situational awareness can better help businesses prepare for these phenomena. This week, we will be discussing a topic that is looming in many of our minds in the wake of last year, wildfires and extreme drought. We will discuss when and why these destructive fires occur, what risks and costs are associated with them, and how situational awareness can help you protect your personnel, assets, and businesses. We will also be discussing how climate change and drought conditions this season will further complicate efforts to contain and extinguish these volatile and costly disasters. If you have any questions during this presentation, please feel free to enter them into the box on the right-hand side of your screen, and we will answer them at the end. My name is Vanessa Rosado. I'm an intelligence analyst with Swan Island Networks, and joining me today is my colleague Josephine Nett, a fellow intelligence analyst. Today, we'd like to take some time to discuss two wildfire complexes that were particularly destructive to their respective regions, namely California's lightning complex of 2020 and Australia's Black Summer, which lasted from June 2019 to May 2020. These historical profiles will hopefully contextualize the immediate and long-term impacts that we will be discussing later on. Before we begin, however, we'd like to take a look at some general wildfire statistics observed over the last several years in the United States, as well as discuss the leading causes for wildfires, what seasons they are most active, and how these trends are being impacted by climate change and drought. We'll also discuss predictions for this year's wildfire season and early indications of its severity and impact. We'll then go through the wildfire examples before discussing some of the additional risks and impacts associated with wildfires. We'll also take a minute to explore how COVID-19 further complicates the subject at hand. Finally, we'll close today's webinar with an overview of TX360's situational awareness technology, touching on the analyst-curated tools and content that enable businesses to monitor these events and protect themselves, their employees, and their assets in the event of a wildfire or related disaster. According to the National Interagency Fire Center, 58,950 wildfires occurred in the US in 2020, resulting in 10.1 million acres being burned. US wildfire damages on average have trended dramatically upward over the last 3 decades, as indicated by the graph on the left-hand side of your screen. Last year, direct damages totaled $16.5 billion, ranking 2020 as the third costliest year on record, behind 2017 and 2018, which resulted in $24 billion and $22 billion respectively. However, it is important to consider the indirect costs associated with wildfires as well, a sum that often cannot be calculated for many years following the event itself. Let's look briefly at 2017 damage estimate, for example. A 2020 study carried out by Headwaters Economics found that although direct damages in California totaled $14 billion, the cost of indirect effects such as pollution, soil degradation, and the disruption of regional and national supply chains was closer to $100 billion. The study suggests that costs associated with long-term health effects related to wildfire exposure may be as high as $450 billion. Researchers at Stanford University estimate that although the direct death toll for US wildfires last year was around 43, the indirect death toll due to inhalation of wildfire smoke, especially during the peak of the COVID-19 pandemic, was likely between 1,300 and 3,000. As sobering as these numbers appear, what is more concerning is the indication of a general trend toward larger, faster-moving wildfires that are increasingly hard to contain and extinguish. Some meteorologists predict, given current conditions, that this year's season will burn 9.5 million acres of land across the western United States, which would represent 130% of the 5-year average and 140% of the 10-year average. Early indications seem to confirm these predictions. According to the National Interagency Fire Center, from January 1st to May 13th this year, approximately 20,780 fires have resulted in the burning of over 687,000 acres of land. During the same period last year, 14,890 fires had burned around 440,000 acres. In short, this year is projected to see more extreme and more frequent wildfires in the United States. To understand why 2020 is shaping up to be such a destructive wildfire season, it is necessary to establish and define a few important characteristics of these fires. The first is that although wildfires are a natural phenomena, they are most often triggered by human causes. According to a 2017 study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, 84% of wildfires reported in the United States between 1992 and 2012 were human-caused. Often these events are sparked unintentionally by power lines, electrical wiring, or machinery such as vehicles or industrial equipment. However, several devastating fires have been attributed to arson, such as the 2020 Markley fire in Solano County, which was started in an attempt to destroy evidence of a murder and resulted in 2 additional deaths. The second is that wildfire damage is compounded severely by weather conditions, namely low relative humidity and gusty winds. In the case of the California wildfire season, weather systems such as the Santa Ana, Sundowner, and Diablo winds contribute both to the dryness of the chaparral vegetation that acts as fuel, as well as the volatility and speed of the fire once it begins to burn. Under the right conditions, wildfires have been recorded spreading at a rate of 14 miles per hour, which is under a 4-mile pace. The dangerously low moisture levels caused by these wind systems are only a small piece of the underlying conditions contributing to this year's elevated wildfire risk, however. An unprecedented portion of the continental US is experiencing severe drought conditions this year, just over 43% of the lower 48 states. Water shortages have prompted restrictions and a state of emergency in California. Experts warn that the Colorado River may face its first ever water shortage, affecting over 40 million people that rely on the reservoirs fed by the river for drinking water and irrigation. These conditions contribute to faster burn rates, and fire volatility as well. Researchers at San Jose State University's Wildfire Interdisciplinary Center noted that drought conditions this year have severely impacted chaparral live fuel moisture content, meaning the vegetation often fueling these wildfires is much drier this year. Here we can see current data for total, new, and old chamise growth at the Wildfire Interdisciplinary Center's primary observation site in Blackberry Hill, California. 2017 data is blue, lowest recorded values between 2013 and 2017 are red, and the 10-year average is in dashed green. As you can see, 2020 values representing new growth fall consistently below the 10-year average, hovering around the lowest values recorded for that region. This data indicates 2 things. The first is that this drought is having a severe impact on vegetation moisture levels throughout wildfire-prone areas, providing quick lighting and fast-burning fuels for any potential spark, human-caused or otherwise. The second is that burn scars, the areas scorched by wildfires, are taking longer to regrow vegetation, increasing the risk of debris flows and landslides, which we will return to later in the webinar. Now that we've established a few of the conditions contributing to the severity of this year's wildfire season, let's turn to the kinds of disruptions associated with these events and the impacts that they may have on your business. Evacuations are perhaps the most obvious example of disruptions related to wildfires, but it is important to note that this impact takes on a new meaning to a workforce shaped by the COVID-19 pandemic. In previous years, businesses were primarily responsible for monitoring their own assets, including work sites, office buildings, and warehouses. However, many employees are still working from their homes in 2021, leaving businesses with a dispersed workforce and therefore a broader area that must be monitored for emerging threats. This can present difficulties when trying to stay informed of expanding evacuation zones that may be threatening employees across a widespread area. Additionally, changes to evacuation zones may happen rapidly and without early warning. Employees may not have time to safely prepare themselves for long absences from their homes and remote workspaces. We'll explore the challenges presented by a remote workforce in greater depth later on in the presentation. Closures also present a serious disruption threat for many businesses, complicating the distribution of goods, as well as the mobility and safety of employees when commuting to work or traveling for business. Power shutoffs, landslides, and dangerous air quality are less obvious impacts from these events that can cause much more severe disruptions in the long term for businesses. I'm going to hand things off to Josephine to go over what causes these disruptions, what they may look like for your business, and additional security risks presented by the wildfire season.
Thanks, Vanessa. As she mentioned, my name is Josephine Nett. I'm also an intelligence analyst here at Swan Island Networks. So yeah, let's get into some of these impacts, starting with power shutoffs. So one of the biggest impacts felt during wildfire season are power shutoffs. A public safety power shutoff, or PSPS, involves a utility preemptively de-energizing power lines as a precaution against weather conditions that might damage equipment and spark a fire. High winds that come with the season can blow down power lines or blow debris into those lines. And this can cause sparks that could ignite tinder dry grass. According to California's Public Utility Commission, power lines have been blamed for roughly half of the most destructive wildfires in California history. From 2013 to 2019, there were 33 of these shutoffs in California alone. To the left is an example of a release from PG&E, showing the weekly potential for a power shutoff. As you can see, in days 3 and 4, residents could expect to see a PSPS due to the elevated fire danger in 6 out of the 9 geographic zones seen on the right of the graphic. In addition to planned power shutoffs, it's also important to remember power outages. Outages are unplanned, but can also be caused by wildfires, especially those started by lightning. Both shutoffs and outages can have similar impacts on businesses. Some of the most basic impacts include computers and internet not working. This can in turn prevent many employees from being able to work, especially since the COVID pandemic prompted many employees to work remotely, resulting in a much more distributed workforce that is harder to protect against planned or unplanned outages. And for employees who don't work remotely, outages can often cause public transit suspensions, hampering the ability to commute. Company systems may also be offline, including security and payment systems. Unfortunately, this can cause an increase in looting and robberies. For example, during the CZU lightning complex, which we'll discuss later, widespread looting was reported in the Santa Cruz Mountains area. In terms of outages and shutoffs, some industries are impacted more heavily than others, including data centers and education. Manufacturing, for example, is especially vulnerable to equipment damage during outages, and 1 hour of power loss can equate to nearly $5 million in losses for this industry. In addition, retail can be heavily impacted. For example, a large grocery store could lose hundreds of thousands of dollars in perishable goods during a lengthy planned outage. Finally, healthcare systems can be severely impacted by outages. Hospitals generally rely on diesel generators. However, because they're idle assets that sit unused 99% of the time, they face a high risk for startup failures without diligent and continuous maintenance. On the left-hand side, you can see the shutoff areas in California in October of 2019, initially affecting around 2.5 million people, but expanding to cause over 3 million people to lose power. Planned shutoffs have been standard practice for many years in rural areas, but this event was unusual for its size and impact on the densely populated Bay Area. Through this, you can tell that although the fires, marked here in red, seem to be confined to a small area, they impact homes and businesses within hundreds of miles. Let's now discuss landslides, which can impact fire areas for years after they burn. So let's start here with the most basic question. How are landslides even caused by wildfires? Well, during a wildfire, burning plants release chemicals that create a water-resistant layer on top of the soil. The fires also completely erode flora and their roots, leaving loose soil and rocks. When saturated by heavy rainfall, the water can no longer sink into the soil and therefore pushes the loose soil and rocks, which, when moving, can travel at avalanche speeds. The most common types of landslides are debris flows, rock slides, and mudslides. And these disasters can have long-reaching and long-lasting impacts for the areas in which they occur. On the left-hand side here, you can see fire borders outlined in red and green. Within those borders, you can see the number of landslides marked by neon green dots that occurred in this area of Southern California following the San Gabriel and Colby fires. Landslides cause property damage, injury, death, and adversely affect a variety of resources. The property damage is especially severe for any structures downslope of fire events, or areas where flooding is particularly common. Water supplies, dams, roadways, railways, and pipelines can all be impacted for years after a slide event. The negative economic effects of landslides include the cost to repair structures, loss of property value, and the disruption of transportation routes. The disruption of transportation routes in particular can often have severe impacts on supply chains. Evacuations caused by these landslides, or even just the threat of these landslides, can shut down a business's workforce, especially, as mentioned, with a more dispersed workforce than ever before. Finally, domestic and irrigation water lines can be affected, which can shut down industries like agriculture, once again impacting supply chains all the way up through and including retail. All of these impacts can come up to 2 years after a wildfire has been fully contained, meaning that just because a wildfire is over doesn't mean it can't still have serious impacts on your business. For example, shortly after the severe wildfires in Southern California in late 2017, a series of overnight mud flows in Santa Barbara County from heavy rainfall killed 23 people and injured a further 163. The mud flows caused at least $177 million in property damage and cost at least $7 million in emergency responses and another $43 million to clean up. Let's now move on to the last major impact we'll discuss today, dangerous air quality. Air Quality Index, or AQI, is a measurement of how hazardous air quality is and ranges on a scale from 0 to 500. 0 is, of course, the goal, where air pollution poses little to no risk. However, reach between 200 and 500, and the entire population can experience serious health effects. In the graphic to the right, you can see that during the wildfire season, much of the West Coast is consistently living with an AQI classified as between unhealthy and hazardous. Let's now take a closer look at the impacts of hazardous AQI on health and businesses. Wildfires produce a range of harmful air pollutants, from known cancer-causing substances to tiny particles that are smaller than dust and pollen. Because of their size, these pollutants can slip through the natural defenses of the nose and lungs and enter the bloodstream, eventually damaging vital organs. Health problems related to wildfire smoke exposure can be as mild as eye and respiratory tract irritation and as serious as worsening of heart and lung disease, including asthma, and even premature death. Not only can this pollution result in losses of human life, it can also be very costly in dollars. A 2017 study led by the Environmental Protection Agency estimated that the cost of short-term exposures to US wildfires occurring between 2008 and 2012 that led to premature deaths or hospital admissions was $63 billion. And the cost of long-term exposures was estimated at $450 billion. Another study found that air pollution, including that caused by wildfire smoke, cost the global economy $225 billion each year in lost labor income. Hazardous air quality also has direct impacts on businesses. In terms of people, studies have shown that a higher AQI leads to lower productivity and an increase in absenteeism and sick leave at work. It also impacts certain industries that rely on outdoor consumerism, including tourism and outdoor recreation. For example, according to the US Bureau of Economic Analysis, the outdoor recreation economy accounted for $459.8 billion in 2019 of the country's total GDP. A disruption to this industry can have huge economic costs for an entire region, especially places in the West, which rely on tourism throughout numerous national parks. Developers also face particular economic risks when it comes to a high AQI, including added costs such as advanced air filtration technology. Finally, potential employees have been shown to be more adverse to living and working in areas known for high levels of air pollution, which can impact talent recruitment for companies. Now that we've discussed some of these impacts generally, let's look at some real-world examples that highlight them. So we'll start here with the Australia bushfires, which burned between June of 2019 and May of 2020 for a total of nearly 1 year. They burned over 46 million acres across the country, with the most heavily impacted areas in New South Wales and Victoria. As you can see in the right-hand graphic, however, the bushfires were spread across the entire country. They were started by a variety of factors, with lightning being the cause of about half the cases. According to a CSIRO government report, the intensity and size of the bushfires were caused by weather, vegetation, and climate change. In 2019, southern and eastern Australia experienced record low rainfall and record high temperatures. In fact, as you can see, the country is warming at a faster rate than the global average. This has led to more intense fire seasons as measured by the Forest Fire Danger Index, or FFDI. 2019 saw the highest annual accumulated FFDI on record in the country. Finally, the nationally averaged rainfall was 40% below average for the year, making it the country's driest year since records began in 1900. And as Vanessa mentioned before, all of these things are attributed to longer and more intense fire seasons. So these bushfires directly caused 34 deaths and indirectly caused 445 due to complications related to smoke inhalation. They cost nearly $103 billion in damages and destroyed over 9,000 buildings, including 3,000 homes. This is very interesting when compared to the 1974-75 bushfires, which were actually much larger, burning nearly 290 million acres. However, due to their lower intensity and more remote location, the 1974 fires cost only about $36.5 million when adjusted for inflation. During the 2019-2020 fires, the top 4 tourist destinations in the country, Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, and the Gold Coast, were all in fire-ravaged areas. The tourism loss alone accounts for about $32 billion of the total estimated $103 billion in losses. The more remote 1974-75 fires, in comparison, had little to no effect on tourism. Here we can see that these fire disasters are not just about size. When more intense and centrally located, they can cost exponentially more in damages. The AQI across Australia also had major impacts around the country. For example, in December, the AQI in Sydney was measured at 2,552, or 12 times the hazardous level, which, as we've mentioned, ranges from 200 to 500. According to the World Health Organization, people who work outdoors are particularly vulnerable to health issues related to a high AQI. So industries with outdoor workers such as construction, traffic, agriculture, and sports were more heavily impacted by the fires, as their workers were primarily confined indoors due to hazardous air quality. Some businesses and institutions were even forced to close for long periods at a time due to excessive levels of air pollution. The bushfires also scorched pasture, destroyed livestock, and razed vineyards, with regrowth and recovery stretching water resources that were already challenged by drought. Reports indicated that the country's dairy supply would be hit the hardest, with Victoria and New South Wales, Australia's key milk-producing states, suffering the greatest loss of farmland and infrastructure damage. 3 separate states of emergency were also declared in New South Wales during the bushfires. These gave authorities the power to open and close roads at will, which further impacted supply chains for any businesses using roads as a means of transport. The mandatory evacuations that came with the declarations also often meant employees were not able to work. Finally, these declarations gave authorities the power to shut down essential utilities, including electricity, gas, and water, which often shut down a business's operations completely. Now that we've seen how some of the impacts played out in an international fire, let's take a closer look at a domestic example. The California lightning complex fires were a combination of 3 devastating fires, the CZU, LNU, and SCU complexes, that burnt between August and October of 2020. Collectively, they burnt over 800,000 acres of land, killed 7 people, injured 12, and destroyed over 3,000 structures. The complexes were started by a series of unusual thunderstorms caused by the moistures of diminishing tropical storm Fausto that hit most of Northern California on August 16th and 17th. With the thunderstorms came a reported between 8,000 to 11,000 lightning strikes that sparked at least 500 fires in a 72-hour period. Lightning is an increasingly common cause of large blazes, and climate change has been directly linked to an increase in lightning strikes over the continental US. In fact, 44% of wildfires across the western US were triggered by lightning between 1992 and 2015, but those fires were actually responsible for 71% of the total area burned. As you can see, the fires were all burning relatively close to each other, and therefore impacted an enormous area of land. Let's now take a closer look at what some of those impacts were. So as I mentioned in the overview, the fires caused deaths, injuries, and destroyed thousands of structures. But how are these fires even able to burn out of control so quickly? Well, in the days following the lightning strikes, fire resources were stretched extremely thin due to the large number of fires that popped up basically overnight. So the small fires were not contained in their early stages. This allowed multiple small fires to combine and burn out of control. It's also important to remember that when firefighting resources are stretched thin, there are fewer resources available to respond to other fire events, such as small business and industrial fires. In the case of the complex fires, over 2,000 firefighting personnel were dispatched to collectively fight the three fires. CAL FIRE Incident Commander Billy C. described the situation, saying, "We have very little firefighting resources. The emergency response capabilities in California have been pushed to their extent. In fact, officials even brought in firefighters from neighboring states to help with the CZU fire." The fires also forced major evacuations in nearly a dozen counties. The CZU fire alone forced evacuations of over 77,000 in the first week of burning. And nearly 2 weeks later, 52,000 were still displaced. This highlights the longevity potential of wildfires and their impacts to businesses. A company might be able to do without a portion of its workforce for a couple of days, but after a couple of weeks, the losses can be more severe. It's also important to note that all industries, not just those that operate outdoors, are at risk. For example, the academic industry was massively impacted when UC Santa Cruz was evacuated due to the CZU complex, disrupting over 20,000 students, staff, and faculty. The hospitality industry was also greatly impacted as hotels became temporary evacuation shelters. In addition, the air quality was negatively impacted by the fires. For example, several parks in Marin County were forced to close due to hazardous air quality in the area. On the bottom right, you can see the AQI in California on September 8th, about 3 weeks after the lightning strikes hit the region. As you can see, much of the Bay Area remained in the most dangerous category of AQI, which is why officials advised everyone in fire areas, which as we've seen covers a huge area of land, to remain indoors. This means businesses that relied on in-person work effectively had to shut down for months as commuting became nearly impossible. Some of the industries most affected were restaurant, shopping, and customer service. But these fires didn't just directly impact people, they also impacted infrastructure, much of which is vital to the economy and the survival of supply chains. One of the greatest impacts that the fires had on communities was felt in their water systems. Fires damaged water systems so that residents could not drink or boil water until late October. According to officials, the ultimate repair bill for the water systems could run between $10 and $20 million. Some water systems were not directly impacted by the fires, but were used so extensively by firefighters that they also needed repairs before they were able to be used again. This also had impacts on businesses, but especially those who rely heavily on irrigation systems. As we've mentioned, as the agricultural industry was devastated by the fires, so in turn were manufacturing plants, transport, and retail. Power outages were also common for residents in the area. Officials reported that the fires were the cause of the biggest disruption of the state's power grid in nearly 2 decades. Following the initial lightning strikes, over 70,000 residents were without power. And as discussed previously, power outages and shutoffs can be detrimental to businesses, and many businesses here fell within the shutoff zones for these fires. Crews often turned off other utilities in fire danger zones, including gas and oil. Without these essential utilities, once again, many industries such as retail, education, and even healthcare were forced to suspend or completely shut down operations. And some businesses were never able to recover from these shutdowns. In the graphic to the left, you can see just how many structures were damaged or completely destroyed in the area following the fires. You can see that the majority of the damage assessments fall into the destroyed category. The roads in and around these structures were often blocked by debris or closed by first responders for prolonged periods of time. These closures were detrimental to many businesses as the cost to rework transportation routes grew. The real estate industry in the area also faced huge losses as thousands of homes were destroyed. However, many of the structures were also non-residential and stood as assets to businesses in the area. These businesses often only had a day's notice before being forced to evacuate, meaning thousands or more dollars in losses. And finally, these fires also did not escape landslides. In January of 2020, thousands of residents were evacuated near the burn lines of the California Lightning Complex fires ahead of heavy rains. For example, over 5,000 residents were evacuated in the Santa Cruz Mountains area alone. This example illustrates that even if a fire is no longer actively burning, it can still cause disasters that can destroy assets, halt rebuilding efforts, and displace a workforce. Let's now finally turn to some unique wildfires that carry with them interesting secondary security impacts. So to round out this section, let's take a look at some wildfires that had secondary security impacts associated with them. Recently, in April of 2021, a wildfire near Cape Town, South Africa burnt almost 1,500 acres of land, injured 5 people, and caused thousands to evacuate. However, the main impact from this fire was in the damage it caused to the University of Cape Town. Thousands of priceless works were lost from the campus's special collections library, and 2 other historic buildings nearby were completely destroyed. In many cases, communities are able to rebuild after a fire, but as we can see in this case, sometimes there are precious cultural assets destroyed by wildfires that are unfortunately irreplaceable. Our next example is the Mount Carmel forest fire, which burned for about 3 days in the Haifa region of Israel in December of 2010. It burned 12,000 acres, killed 44 people, and caused the evacuation of 17,000. In the days following the fire, authorities discovered arson cases popping up across the region. They believe arsonists were attempting to take advantage of the large force that was working on the Carmel fire to set these fires elsewhere. This is an example of how the overextension of the firefighting workforce allowed for additional security threats, in this case, the crime of arson. Finally, very close to home, the Oregon fires between July and December of 2020 burned a combined 1.2 million acres across over 2,000 fires. 11 people were killed, tens of thousands evacuated, and over 3,000 buildings were destroyed. These fires highlight the importance of accurate and timely information when dealing with wildfires, as misinformation spread that Antifa activists were setting the fires purposefully to loot evacuated houses. These rumors were shared so widely, in fact, that some residents refused to evacuate for fear of getting robbed, going against direct orders from officials. As you can see from these examples, there are often secondary security impacts associated with wildfires that you must also be prepared for. I'll now turn it back over to Vanessa to take a closer look at how the COVID-19 pandemic has further complicated this matter of wildfires.
Thank you, Josephine. Although maintaining business continuity in the midst of a disaster such as the wildfires we've discussed today is undoubtedly an overwhelming task in itself, it is complicated further by the COVID-19 pandemic. As we mentioned before, businesses with remote workforces have more widely dispersed assets to monitor for expanding evacuation zones, road closures, and dangerous air quality conditions. Employers must maintain up-to-date records of employee contact information and current location, whether they are working from home, from an evacuation center, or from a friend or family member's home. Keeping track of your most valuable assets during a disaster and in the recovery that follows is vital to ensuring your work atmosphere remains safe and cohesive. COVID-19 has had impacts on many aspects of our day-to-day life over the last 18 months, including emergency response to disaster situations. In a normal case, evacuation shelters represent safety, shelter, and an opportunity to check in with those that have been impacted by a disaster. With a worldwide pandemic, however, there are many hesitations and concerns. Many shelters remain open, but must adhere to restrictions and precautions to combat the spread of COVID-19. This may include reduced capacity, temperature screening, more strict cleaning practices, and mask requirements. In many cases, COVID-19 may worsen evacuation fatigue, experienced when residents are asked to evacuate frequently. Evacuation fatigue often leads individuals who are at risk to not adhere to warnings issued by local officials with regard to evacuating safely, and is compounded by the exposure risk presented by public shelters amidst a global pandemic. Smoke from wildfires forced the closure of thousands of COVID-19 testing sites last year, disrupting efforts to identify and trace exposure to the virus. Many counties in Western states advocated to move dining indoors so that patrons could dine without being exposed to the harmful effects of wildfire smoke. In fact, the CDC released data last summer that warned that exposure to wildfire smoke, in addition to causing irritation of the lungs and altering immune function, increased patients' susceptibility to COVID-19 and other respiratory infections. Thankfully, with the widespread availability of vaccines and ongoing communal efforts to contain the virus, these threats aren't as severe as they may have been 6 months ago. All the same, it is important to remain vigilant to protect your employees and smoothly transition back into a comfortable and safe work environment. Now that we've gone over the impending threats of this wildfire season, let's talk about how we at Swan Island Networks can support your organization with situational awareness technology. Analyst alerting gives near real-time reporting with vetted sources, images, and location data for a multitude of threats. Dashboards integrate asset and risk data into a common operating picture, so you can quickly identify critical events that may threaten life safety or cause business disruptions. These dashboards display graphics, maps, alerts, and news from government officials, utility companies, news outlets, and social media reports. Intelligence pages are also provided for larger incidents, which compile all of this information and are updated multiple times a day. We also have 24/7 automated alerts from the National Interagency Fire Center, CAL FIRE, INSAWeb, and several other fire agencies that provide updates on fire size and containment, as well as evacuation warnings and orders. Receive alerts near employees, property, or other asset locations by customizing your asset proximity. Analysts are working daily to keep you informed of wildfire developments and the threat they present to your business. Analysts track and send breaking alerts regarding new starts, as well as developments with ongoing fire incidents, such as changes to evacuation zones, reported damages, including injuries and loss of life, utility outages, and transportation disruptions on the ground and in the air. These alerts include maps, models, images, video footage, and other resources from fire agencies and officials, news outlets, and social media. Here is an example of a wildfire dashboard from August of last year. As you can see, we have detailed map overlays that demonstrate the fire's containment lines, current evacuation orders and warnings, and ongoing closures. Some of the sources we track include the National Interagency Fire Center, the United States Forest Service, INSAWeb, CAL FIRE, the National Weather Service, which allows us to track critical fire weather conditions across the United States, local and regional fire agencies, emergency management offices, police stations, Department of Transportation offices, power utilities companies, local news and journalists, and social media chatter surrounding the event. In addition to analyst alerts, we have a number of automated alerts that go out 24/7 to our clients. These include severe thunderstorm watches and warnings, which allow us to monitor areas for potential lightning strikes, and fire weather watches and warnings from the National Weather Service. During a wildfire, clients can receive regular updates from INSAWeb, CAL FIRE, and the National Interagency Fire Center, as well as notifications regarding air quality levels from AirNow. Following a wildfire, you can stay informed of potential debris flows and mudslides with flash flood watches and warnings, as well as local damage and hazard reports such as roadway flooding, downed trees and power lines, and debris. Each of these automated alerts comes with detailed descriptions and can be filtered to any asset proximity radius, polygon, or route. Altogether, these sources provide a complete picture of developing natural disaster incidents such as wildfires and allow for the quick delivery of relevant information. I'm going to pass things over to Josephine to review how these sources come together in our wildfire reporting to give you near real-time coverage of wildfire incidents as they emerge.
Thanks, Vanessa. So what you see here is an example of what our alerting timeline for fires might look like. As fires are popping up frequently, we're continually alerting on new starts while also making sure to update any active incidents, including information on new evacuations and closures. Automated and analyst-curated alerts like severe thunderstorm warnings and red flag warnings can alert you ahead of potential fires. You can expect analyst-curated alerts on new starts to fires as identified by local agencies, news outlets, or social media sources. This information will include the size and containment of the fire, as well as any known evacuations or road closures associated with it. Oftentimes, fires are fully contained within the day, but as we've seen, others can last months. For these longer wildfires, updates in the days following the event will include coverage of damage, death, injuries, or other associated disruptions. For months-long fires, you can expect daily updates, which include change in size and containment. They'll also be accompanied by images and overlays of the fire boundaries. You can always expect to receive real-time notifications of changes to evacuation zones, road closures, and at-risk areas, as well as information on changes in air quality. As Vanessa mentioned, we have dashboards to monitor fires and fire weather across regions that can include map overlays, geotagged alerts, outlook graphics, meteorologist discussion, and more. They're also accessible and updated 24/7. For larger fires, we'll have those incident pages created, which are updated multiple times a day. The incident pages are updated until full containment of a fire is reached. However, we'll also provide any updates on landslides, flooding, and their associated evacuations and closures after a fire is fully contained. I'll now hand it back to you, Vanessa, to close us out.
Great. Looking forward at our spring webinar series, our 5th installment of Earthquakes, Tsunamis, and Volcanoes will take place in early July, and this will be followed by our final webinar in late July covering winter storms. You can access each of our webinars on YouTube as we will upload them following these events. Thank you so much for taking the time to join our discussion on wildfires, severe drought, and how situational awareness can better prepare your business to navigate the increasingly severe threat these disasters present. We will now be happy to answer any questions that have come up over the course of our presentation.
Thank you so much to both of you, Josephine and Vanessa. I'm gonna see what we've gathered here for questions so far. So for number 1, we have a question that says, I can see why this service is helpful during wildfire season, but do I need situational awareness in the off season?
I can go ahead and take that one. I think that's a great question. One thing to keep in mind when discussing these evolving climate and drought concerns is that, like we said, wildfire season is getting longer and longer, and with that, it's becoming harder to predict when these fires may occur. Some experts have warned that what we understand to be wildfire season may soon be year-round in wildfire-prone states, such as those in the Western United States. And additionally, the risks associated with these disasters don't end when crews establish full containment on a fire, as Josie mentioned. Debris flows are a constant off-season threat to burn scar areas during periods of heavy rainfall and flooding. But setting that aside, even if wildfires aren't an imminent threat to your business operations or supply chain year-round, you can still use situational awareness technology to monitor other threats to your business, many of which have been discussed in this webinar series. Some examples include severe weather such as thunderstorms, tornadoes, hurricanes, and tropical storms, and natural disasters such as earthquakes, tsunamis, and volcanoes, which will be covered in our next webinar on July 1st.
Yeah, absolutely. Our second question is, should I worry about wildfires if my assets aren't in the West or in rural fire-prone areas? What if I'm located right in the middle of a city?
Yeah, I can take that one. I think that's a great question. It's important to remember that while wildfires do usually spread throughout rural areas, their impacts can still be felt for hundreds of miles. So, for example, with the Oregon fires last year that we discussed, although there weren't any fires directly in the city of Portland, the AQI was still at hazardous levels for weeks. And as we've seen, that dangerous air quality can heavily impact businesses, ranging from employees being unable to work all the way to having to totally shut down. And if you also remember the power shutoff example we mentioned earlier, those fires weren't happening directly in densely populated areas, but nearly 3 million people were still affected in those areas, which were in and around San Francisco. And those outages can also cause widespread supply chain issues due to plants, shutting down or getting damaged, and that can go across multiple regions. And in terms of the second part of the question, assets falling outside of fire-prone regions. As Vanessa discussed, fire seasons are getting longer and more intense, which means they're also impacting areas that they haven't really impacted as much historically. For example, last year there were about 33,000 wildfires that burned across the East Coast. And just last month, a fire in New Jersey burnt about 500 acres. So, different from the West Coast, we don't usually think of the East Coast as having a lot of fires, but there were a lot of those in the past. They're also reported on every single continent except for Antarctica last year. So you can see that just because your business might be located in a city or outside of a fire-prone area, definitely does not mean it's immune to wildfire impacts.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Let's see. Looks like we have one last question. This one says, with thousands of fires happening each year in the US alone, how can I stay on top of the relevant fires without getting overwhelmed?
That is a reasonable concern. As I mentioned before, the 2020 wildfire season saw just over 58,000 fires just in the US, which is an overwhelming number. Add to that the fact that each region has a different lead agency that coordinates fire containment efforts and reports out different important information. Staying on top of developing incidents becomes a complicated task. Our analysts at Swan Island Networks use TX360's situational awareness technology to compile the information that's relevant to you and your business. We consult a wide range of sources, as mentioned before, and alert out information according to your asset locations and preferences. We also provide dashboards that create a common operating picture to easily monitor your region and any active wildfire incidents that may be nearby.
Alrighty. I think that's it for questions. Thank you guys so much for attending our webinar today. I'll do another shot here of the upcoming schedule, our next couple of webinars in July, and we hope to see you then. Thank you again, Josephine and Vanessa.
Thank you.
Thank you all.